Okay, so today we'll cover a very important topic, that is the nervous system. So if you see, the nervous system is divided into two: the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. So nervous system is broadly classified into two types: central and the peripheral. Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, very important structures which are included within the central nervous system, that is the brain as well as the spinal cord itself. So each of these have very important structures within them, like the cerebrum, the two cerebral hemispheres which we seen as the brain. Then inside that there is something called a diencephalon. Then we have the brain stem as well as the cerebellum. So all these are parts of the this central nervous system, which is within the brain part. Okay. Then the spinal cord will show two cervical enlargements. One is the cervical enlargement and the lumbosacral. We'll see all these structures uh, lately. Okay. Then coming to the peripheral nervous system. What is peripheral nervous system? It consists of the nerves which are going outside. Okay. So there are nerves which are coming from the brain and the brain system itself. That those are called as the cranial nerves. Cranial nerves which are coming from the brain and brain stem. Okay. So here is the brain, and the brain stem will be just below that. That part will give rise to nerves. Those are called as cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs, 12 on the right side and 12 on the left side. So they are called as 12 pairs. Then spinal cord. This is a long structure extending from the brainstem will be the spinal cord. So the nerves coming from the spinal cord will be called as the spinal nerves. The nerves coming from the spinal cord are called as spinal nerves. So there are again they are in pairs, right and left side. So there are 31 pairs. Spinal nerves are 31 pairs and the cranial nerves are 12 pairs. What is the difference between cranial nerves and spinal nerves? Cranial nerves coming from the brain and the brain stem. Spinal nerves coming from the spinal cord. Okay. Now here, if you see here, so this is the brain, which consists of these are the cerebral hemisphere, cerebrum, and here is the cerebellum. And below that, if you see here, this part here, there is something called as brainstem. We will show better pictures. And the nerves, these are nerves coming from the brain and the brainstem. So these are called as the cranial nerves. Then there are nerves coming from the spinal cord. These are called as the spinal nerves. So there is a difference between the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. Functionally, so that was the structural classification. Then functional classification, again it is of two types, that is the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. All the nerves which you saw, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, okay, most of them, all the spinal nerves as well as most of the cranial nerves, they are the somatic nerves, because they are supplying the different parts of the body. Okay, so the nerves that take message from the sense organs to the CNS, from the CNS to the sense organs. So any nerves which are going to the sense organs or the receptors which are present in the different parts of the body. Then there are something called as autonomic nervous system, which the name itself indicates it is automatic. So here this is voluntary. So whatever you want to do, if you are lifting uh, something from the ground, or moving, or sitting, standing, all these are voluntary movements done by the somatic nerves. But there are some functions like the beating of the heart, like the digestion, everything is automatic. So those are supplied by some special nerves called as autonomic nervous system, which is automatic, which is involuntary. So involuntary means not under our control. So it is automatic. So this involuntary or the autonomic nervous system is divided into two types: sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic. So Functionally, the nervous system is broadly classified in somatic and autonomic nervous system. So somatic will be voluntary, which we can do with our will, but autonomic, as the name indicates, is automatic, which is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. What is the function of these two? Some of the important functions, like the sympathetic will do, is it helps in increase breathing. It helps in increase in the heart rate, as well as decrease digestive activity. So increases something and some it will decrease, especially the breathing and the heart rate, especially when you're afraid, when you want to run from a place. Okay, so those are done by the sympathetic nerves. That is called as the flight, fright, and flight. Okay, three F's, which stand for the fear. The first is when you're afraid, so your breathing increases as well as heart rate increases. Then fight as well as flight, so running away from that or fighting. So all these will increase the breathing as well as heart rate, as well as decrease the intestine, the digestive activity. So this is done by sympathetic nerves. Then parasympathetic activates or activities opposing the sympathetic. Just opposite to that functions will be the parasympathetic. Increase the GIT, the digestive motility. So more increase digestion, and decrease in the breathing and heart rate will be done by the parasympathetic. Just opposite to the sympathetic will be the parasympathetic. Okay, so if you know one, you know the other. Just opposite will be the other one. So here you can see this is part of the sympathetic nerves which are coming here. So all these are sympathetic nerves which are coming here. So this is sympathetic and this is the parasympathetic, like the cranial nerves. Okay, some of the cranial nerves as well as some of the even the sacral nerves. So it is called as craniosacral outflow. Craniosacral outflow. All these are nerves. The third, seventh, ninth, and tenth are all part of the parasympathetic as well as the sacral nerves. So they are going to the same organ as well as the like the sympathetic, but their function is opposite. So they're going to the eye, the vision, to the salivary glands, to the heart, lungs, liver, stomach, intestine, small and large intestine, bladder, everywhere. Okay. So these are the parasympathetic, which is also called as the craniosacral outflow, parasympathetic. Okay. Then there is also something called as the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. Now coming to the microscopic structure of the nervous system. If you see under the microscope, so what do you see in the brain and the brainstem and the spinal cord and different nerves? So what exactly you see under the microscope? So the nervous tissue consists of two main cells. One is the nerve cells, which are also called as neurons. The nerve cells are the neurons. And then we have the supporting cells called as the neuroglial cells, or the also called as the glial cells, which support the neurons. So there are the nerve cells or the nervous cells, which are called as neurons, and then we have the supporting cells called as the neuroglial or the glial cells. So two types of nerves. Neurons are the main structures which form the nervous system. So they are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. So neurons, the nerve cells, are the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. Specialized for rapid communication, which helps in the very fast communication from one part of the body to the other part. So the nerves will send the signals, communicate through the signals very fast. So this now coming to the structure and functional unit, that is the neuron. So what is the shape? This is how the neuron will look like. So this is the structure of the neuron. So the neuron is composed of cell body with process called as dendrites and an axon. So this is the neuron, consists of a cell body. This is the cell body of the neuron, and there is inside there is a nucleus. Then there it has finger-like processes. These are called as dendrites. So multiple short process called as dendrites and a long process. This is called as axon. So there are two types of processes. The short processes, all these are called as dendrites. Then, so dendrites here. Okay, then this is the long process. This is called as the axon. So there are two types of processes: dendrites, which are short and multiple, and axon is only one every time. Most of the time it is one. Sometimes it will be two, but usually it is one axon. Dendrites, which carry impulses to the cell body. So the impulses, if you see this arrow, so these impulses, the signals are coming to the cell body through these processes. Okay, so through this process, all the signals are coming to the neuron, and axon, which carry impulses away from the cell body. So, and the axon, it will carry the, if you again see the direction of the conduction, the direction of the arrow, you will understand that the axon is taking the impulses away from the neuron. So dendrites will bring the impulse to the cell body of the neuron, and the axon will carry away the impulses. Okay. Now something called as myelin. What is myelin? The layer of lipid and protein substance form a myelin sheath around some axons. If you see here, axons, sometimes they are covered, sometimes they are not. So sometimes they are covered by myelin sheath. This is the myelin sheath here. You see, this is the covering. Greatly increases the velocity of the impulse conduction. So what is the function of this covering for the axon, which is called as myelin? So this will help in conduction of very fast impulse passing. As soon as the message is sent here, it will pass very fast to the periphery. So that is the function of the myelin, to conduct the impulses very fast. Great increases the velocity of the impulse, means it will go, the impulse, the message will go very fast. That is the function of having a myelin sheath covering around the axon. Now coming to the supporting cells, that is the neuroglia or the glial cells. They form a major component of the nervous system. Even though the neurons are the most important functional and structural units, but the supporting cells will be the majority. Maximum will be majority, which will be supporting cells. Okay, so they form a major component of the nervous system. There are different types of supporting cells, neuroglial cells. So what are those? Okay, so the first one is the oligodendrocytes. These are one of the type of the neuroglial cells, supporting cells. They form the myelin sheath. I said the covering of the axon is by a sheath called as myelin sheath. Okay, so this myelin sheath is formed by this oligodendrocytes. Then there are second type of cells called as astrocytes. Astrocytes. They look like the stars. That's why they are called as astrocytes. They support and maintain the intercellular environment of the whole of the brain stem, spinal cord, everything. Okay. Astrocytes, they support and maintain the intercellular environment, because the brain is very sensitive to the change in the environment. Okay. Then the third type of supporting cells is called as the microglial, which acts as phagocytes. Phagocyte means those cells which eat the dead and destroyed tissues. Those are called as the microglial cells. Okay, these are the phagocytes. Then there is fourth type of cell called as the ependymal cells. Ependymal cells secrete the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid in the brain, around the brain and the spinal cord. That's called as the CSF, cerebrospinal spinal fluid, that is secreted by the ependymal cells. If you see a single brain and the brainstem and other parts of the nervous system, there will be around 100 billion nucleoglial the glial cells. The supporting cells will be 100 billion, around 5 times the number of neurons. So if there are 20 billion neurons in a brain, there will be 100 billion, almost 5 times the number of the neurons. Okay, now coming to the shape, how they look like. Okay, the first one is the oligodendrocyte. We said it forms myelin sheath. If you see here, this is the myelin sheath. This is the myelin sheath. What is the function of myelin sheath? It conducts the impulse very fast. So this is the covering. So inside is the axon. So myelin is around the axon, not the dendrites, axons. So it is covering the axon. So this is called as myelin. This is done by oligodendrocyte. This is one oligodendrocyte covering so many neurons by its processes. The second type of cell, supporting cell, is astrocytes. Astrocyte. If you see here, I said it looks like a star. So these are the astrocytes with multiple processes sitting on different structures. Like here is the neuron with the cell body and the nucleus, and this is the axon, and these are the dendrites. So this astrocyte is sitting on the cell body as well as dendrites as well as blood vessels around it. So it is connecting. So it is present in between them. These are the astrocytes, which look like the stars. The third type of cell is the microglial cells. These are very small cells called as the microglial cells. So what is the function of these microglia? They help in the phagocytosis, eat up the foreign bacteria, virus, anything. Okay. So these are the cell bodies of the neurons, and these are the processes. So here you can see this is a microglial cell. And the fourth type of cell is the ependymal cell. These are the ependymal cells. Okay. So what is the function of the ependymal cell? They secrete the CSF into the central canal of the spinal cord. So here is the CSF filled by secreted by the ependymal cells. Okay. So these are some of the supporting cells which are called as the nucleoglial cells. Now coming to the central nervous system, we saw the different types of cells. One is the neurons; those are the nerve cells, and the supporting cells, which are of the four types. Now coming to which was microscopic study. Now we will come back to the central nervous system itself. So if you see the central nervous system, this is how it looks like. Okay, the brain constitutes about 1/50th of the body weight. So almost 50 times, if you divide the body to 50 times, one time is the size of the brain. If there is 50 kilo person, 1 kilo is the weight of his brain. And if there is 100 kilo person, there will be 2 kilo of brain weight. Okay, approximately. So it is 1/50th of the body weight and lies within the cranial cavity. You might have seen the skull. If you cut the skull and see inside that cavity where the brain is present, it is called as cranial cavity. So this brain is present in the cranial cavity. So what are the parts of this the brain or the central nervous system? One is the cerebrum. So these two hemispheres on either side, which you call it as the brain, has two hemispheres called as the cerebrum on either side, right and left cerebrum. Then we have smaller brain called a cerebellum. This is the cerebellum, smaller brain. Okay. Then we have diencephalon, which is inside here. Okay, within the cerebrum there is a diencephalon with different types of nuclei. Then we have the brainstem. This is the brainstem, which has three parts: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. So these are some of the parts of the central nervous system, which consists of the cerebrum on either side, cerebral hemispheres, then the cerebellum, then diencephalon inside, then this is the brainstem, consists of midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now coming to the cerebrum, if you take a cross section, if you take the section like this and see, okay, so this is how the brain will look like. These are the two hemispheres. This is the one hemisphere, left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere. Two hemispheres, and in between there is a fissure which is called as the longitudinal fissure, which is a deep fissure which separates the two cerebral hemispheres. This is the largest part of the brain. It is divided by deep cleft, the horizontal cerebral fissure. If you see here, this is the largest part of the whole of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, and the two cerebral hemispheres are separated in the center by longitudinal cerebral hemisphere, or the longitudinal fissure between the hemispheres. So this will divide the whole of the cerebral hemisphere into right and left cerebral hemispheres. So we have a right one and the left cerebral hemisphere, each containing one of the lateral ventricle. Within them, there is a cavity which is called as the lateral ventricle. So each hemisphere has a lateral ventricle, and the two are separated at the top by the septum here in the center. The superficial peripheral part of the cerebrum is composed of the nerve cell bodies or gray matter forming the cerebral cortex, and the deep layer consists of the nerve fibers or white matter. If you see here, the whole of the cerebral hemisphere is divided into the gray matter outside is the cerebral cortex and inner medulla, which is whitish in color. So the whole of the cerebral hemisphere is divided into two parts. If you cut a section and see, outer is called as the outer gray matter because it is gray in color, and inner the white matter, which is the nerve fibers. So the gray matter is formed by the cell bodies of the neurons. As you saw, the cell body here will be present. All the cell bodies of the neurons will be present here. So that's why it looks grayish in color. But the fibers running, that is the axons and dendroids, will be especially the axons, they are covered by the myelin sheath, which we saw before. So white sheath will give a whitish color here. So that's why where the axons are present, that is whitish in color, and that is called as the cerebral medulla. Cerebral cortex made up of the cell bodies of neurons, and the cerebral medulla made up of the nerve fibers. They look white, as the name indicates. This is white, and this is gray matter, white matter because the myelin sheath will give it whitish color. Now coming to the cerebrum in more detail. So if you see the cerebral cortex, this is how it looks like. Outside, if you see the cerebrum, so this is how it looks like. The cerebral cortex shows many infoldings of varying depth. If you see here, so there is elevation as well as foldings. Elevation, folding, like this. Okay. So elevations and foldings. So the cerebral cortex shows many infoldings of varying depth. The exposed area of the fold are called as the gyri. So these elevation, these are called as gyri, and the foldings, these are called as the sulci, and these are separated by sulci. The elevated portion, that is the gyri, is separated from the other gyri by a sulcus. This is the sulci. These convolutions greatly increase the surface area of the cerebrum. So these elevations and depressions, sulci and gyri, will give rise to a larger surface area for the cerebrum. Now coming to the cerebrum lobes, cerebral lobes. Each hemisphere of the cerebrum is divided into lobes, which take the names of the bones of the cranium under which they lie. So the whole of the cerebrum, each cerebrum is divided into lobes, and these lobes are named according to the bones. The part of the cerebrum which is under the frontal bone will be called as the frontal lobe. Under the frontal bone, that part of the cerebrum is called as frontal lobe. The occipital, under the occiput will be the occipital lobe. Under the parietal bone will be the parietal lobe. Under the temporal bone will be the temporal lobe. So it is divided into four major areas, four lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. These are the four lobes. I repeat: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and this is the temporal lobe. So these are under specific bones, and they take the name of the bone, and they lie under that bone. Now coming to the functions of the cerebrum. There are three main varieties of activities associated with the cerebral cortex. Mental activities involved in memory, intelligence, sense of responsibility, thinking, reasoning, moral sense, and learning are attributed to the higher center. So, especially the functions like memory, intelligence, sense of responsibility, thinking, reasoning, moral sense, which are mainly seen in case of the human beings, are controlled by the higher centers of the cerebrum. Then the sensory perceptions, including the perception of pain. If there is any injury on the body, it will feel pain. The temperature, if you feel hot or cold because of the temperature variation, this is the sensory. If you touch something, you feel something, sometimes hard, sometimes soft. This is the sensory perception. Sight, you see so many things. So sensory perception. Hearing, you can hear different voices and recognize them. Okay. Then taste, which is present mainly in the tongue. There are receptors for the taste. Then the smell, so that is which is present in the nose. There are receptors, which will all go and connect to the brain. So these are some sensory perception which are going to the brain, like pain, temperature, touch, sight, hearing, taste, and smell. Then initiation and control of the skeletal movements. Okay, so especially the skeletal muscle contractions. So whenever the body wants to move, it will move with the contraction of the different muscles, and the bones will move on their joints. Okay, so this is done by the, again by controlled by the cerebrum. Now coming to the second part, that is called as the diencephalon, which I said will be inside. So what does it include? It includes some very important nuclei inside, that is called as the thalamus, hypothalamus, and other related structures. Thalamus, hypothalamus, and other related structures. If you take coronal section, you can see this is the thalamus here. Okay. Then below that will be the hypothalamus and some other smaller structures which are related to it. Okay. So here again, if you see here, this is the hypothalamus, and deep inside here will be the thalamus. Hypothalamus and the thalamus. Okay. So this along with some other nuclei, but the main will be the thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay, which are part of the diencephalon. Then we have the brain stem, okay, which is connecting the spinal cord with the cerebral hemisphere. So what is this brain stem? So the midbrain is the area of the brain between the cerebrum above and the pons below. So if you see the whole of the brain stem, it is divided into three parts as we said before: midbrain at the top, then the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So midbrain is between the cerebrum above and the pons below. Pons is here, and cerebrum above, and in between is the midbrain. It consists of group of cell bodies and nerve fibers, tracts which connect the cerebrum with the lower parts of the brain and with the spinal cord. The cell bodies act as relay station for the ascending and descending nerve fibers. So there are many fibers which are starting from the brain, and they connect, go to the pons, medulla oblongata through the midbrain, and supply the go to the spinal cord. Or some sensory will go from spinal cord to midbrain, pons, and from there crosses the cerebrum through the midbrain. It goes to the midbrain through the midbrain. So there are very important tracks, ascending as well as descending. Ascending going up, descending going down. Now coming to the pons, which is situated in front of the cerebrum, below the midbrain, and above the medulla oblongata. So this is the pons, which is in front of the cerebrum. Cerebrum is behind, pons is in the front, and it is between the midbrain above and the medulla oblongata below. It consists mainly of nerve fibers which form a bridge between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum, and of the fibers passing between the higher level of the brain and the spinal cord. So it consists mainly of nerve fibers which form a bridge between the two hemispheres. So it is a very important structure which will be again connecting the higher centers with the lower centers. Then we have the medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata, as you can see here, this one. So it is between the spinal cord below and the pons above. So it extends from the pons above and it continues with the spinal cord below. It ends at the foramen magnum. There is a large cavity or opening in the base of the skull. If you see the skull, the bone, then under the base of the skull there is a large cavity opening. So that is called as the foramen magnum, through which the spinal cord, along with this, the spinal cord, along with the medulla oblongata, will come out of the cavity. So that is called as the foramen magnum. So these so the medulla oblongata is functionally very important. Vital center lies in its deeper structure. So very important structures lie within the medulla oblongata. Vital structures means which are very important for life. Which are those? One is the cardiac center. The second is the respiratory center. The third is the vasomotor center. And the fourth is the reflex centers like vomiting, sneezing, coughing, and swallowing. All these centers are present in the medulla oblongata. So the most important will be the cardiac and respiratory, which are very important for the life. So these centers are present here in the medulla oblongata, and they are controlling the cardiac cycles as well as the respiration, along with other functions. So that's why the medulla oblongata is a very important structure here. Now coming to the smaller brain, this is called as the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum, and this is the cerebellum. Cerebellum. The cerebellum is situated behind the pons and immediately below the posterior portion of the cerebrum, occupying the posterior cranial fossa. So it is behind the pons, behind the brain stem, you can say, and below the cerebral hemisphere, and it will be sitting in a cavity called as posterior cranial fossa. If you see the skull cut section, then we have the anterior, middle as well as posterior cranial fossa. So the cerebrum, because it is behind the brainstem, so it is present in the posterior cranial fossa. If we see, the shape is almost ovoid in shape and has two hemispheres. Just like the cerebrum has two hemispheres, similarly there are two hemispheres for the cerebellum also. And they're separated by narrow median strip called as the vermis. In the center, between the two hemispheres, there is a worm-like structure called as vermis. So what is the function of this cerebellum? Cerebellum controls movement, balance as well as coordination. Very important function. One is balance. If you stand upright straight, this is because of the cerebellum is intact. Then coordinated movements like fine movements, fine drawing, painting, and touching something with a finger. All these are controlled, and controlled movements. All these are done by the cerebellum. So cerebellum plays a very important role. Finally, coming to the spinal cord, so it is long structure from the brain stem continues the spinal cord. So if you see here, brain stem here, which concerns midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Below is the spinal cord. So spinal cord is a extended portion from the medulla oblongata. So the spinal cord is elongated, cylindrical part of the central nerve. It is also part of the central nerve system. So this is the extended, long, elongated, cylindrical part of the central nervous system. It lies in the vertebral canal surrounded by meninges and cerebrospinal fluid. This is covered, just like the brain is covered by the skull, even the spinal cord is covered by the bones called as vertebra, and inside the vertebra there is a canal called as vertebral canal. So vertebral canal will be protecting the spinal cord, and it is also covered by meninges, that is the coverings of the brain and the spinal cord, as well as fluid which will give cushioning effect to this brain stem and the brain, that is called as the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. It is continuous above with the medulla oblongata and extend from the upper border of the atlas to the lower border of the first lumbar vertebra. So it extends from if you see, the vertebral column is long compared to the, the spinal cord. So it extends from the medulla oblongata above and extends all the way up to the lower border of the first lumbar vertebra. You see here. So this is the first lumbar vertebra. At this level, this will end, but the nerves will continue down. Okay. The discal end of the cord, that is conus medulla, is cone shape. If you see this part is called as, which is cone shape, ice cream cone shape structure. This is called as the conus medullaris. It is the cone. Okay, it looks like cone, so it is called as conus medullaris. This spinal cord will show two important enlargement. I said it is cylindrical long tube. Okay, but it will show two enlargements. One is called as the cervical enlargement in the neck, and the other enlargement is called as lumbar enlargement. So what are these enlargements? Why they are dilated in this part? The cervical enlargement occurs in the region associated with the origin of the spinal nerve C5 to T1, which innervate the upper limb. So there are nerves coming from the spinal cord to the upper limb. So there are many nerves from here. So that's why this is called as the cervical enlargement. Where they are going? They are going mainly to the upper limb, starting from C5 to T1. That is called as the brachial plexus. Similarly, the lumbosacral enlargement. In the lower part, there is one more enlargement. This is called as the lumbosacral enlargement. Occurs in the region associated with the origin of the spinal nerves L1 to S3, which will innervate the lower limb. So these nerves are going to the lower limb. So that's why there are multiple more nerves coming from here. So this region will show the lumbar enlargement. Okay. So the cervical enlargement, where the nerves are going to the upper limb, and there is lumbosacral enlargement where the nerves are going to the lower limb. Now if you see, this is the cut section of the spinal cord. This is how it looks like. A cross section of the spinal cord shows that it is composed of, if you see here, this is the spinal cord. If you take cross section, if you see at the center, you look a central head-shaped gray matter containing the cell bodies. Just like we saw the gray matter in the brain, so here also there is gray matter. But in the brain, the gray matter is outside, as we saw before, if you remember. So here the gray matter is outside. This the gray matter outside in the cerebrum, and white matter is inside. But here the spinal cord, it is reverse, opposite. So the gray matter is inside, which is the head-shaped gray matter, and outside we have the white matter. So head-shaped central gray matter containing the cell bodies. So whenever there is gray, so it will be usually because of the gray, the cell bodies of the neurons. And white matter because of the axons covered by myelin sheath. The peripheral white matter surround the gray matter formed of axons. Everywhere here there will be axons, so that's why it is looking white, because it is covered by myelin sheath. And at the central there is a canal filled with CSF, which is called a central canal. In the center, if you see here, this is called a central canal filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So it is covered in the center by the spinal cord, as well as the cerebrospinal fluid, as well as outside also it is covered by cerebrospinal fluid. Now coming to the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs, as I said before. So there are 12 cranial nerves coming from the brain and the brainstem, and there are 31 pair. Pair means right and left side, coming from the spinal cord. So the total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves leave the spinal cord. The spinal nerves are named according to the region of the vertebral column with which they are associated. So those nerves which are coming in the neck, they are called as cervical. There are 8 cervical nerves. Then we have the 12 thoracic nerves. Then we have the 5 lumbar. Then we have the 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal nerve. If you remember, similar division we studied when we studied the vertebrae. So if you remember, the vertebrae were also cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. But vertebrae were 34, but spinal nerves are only 31. Okay. So the cervical vertebrae were 7, but the nerves are more, 8 cervical nerves which are coming in the neck. 12 thoracic vertebrae were there, and there are 12 thoracic nerves. 5 lumbar vertebrae were there, and 5 lumbar nerves are there. Then we had 5 sacral nerves, 5 sacral vertebrae, and 5 sacral nerves. And there were 4 vertebrae, 4 coccygeal vertebrae, but there is only 1 coccygeal nerve. So there are extra 3 vertebrae. So there are 34 vertebrae, and there are only 31 pairs of nerves. So if you remember the vertebrae, just remember, you can also remember easily the nerves. but there is some difference. In the cervical, there are 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves. 12 thoracic, this is same. These three are same, and nerves and the vertebra. 12 thoracic nerves and vertebrae, 5 sacral nerves and vertebra, 5 lumbar vertebrae and nerves. When coccygeal nerve is only one, but the coccygeal vertebrae are 4. Okay, so this is all about the central as well as the peripheral nervous system. In general, the nervous system. So if you have any questions regarding this, you can ask me.